All right, thank you for staying with Daybreak. This is the extended version because you're talking about something important. We're talking about leadership in your own capacity, in private sector, in public sector, and who better to talk about this than Dr. Antony Silard. Thank you so much for making time for us. Dr. Antony Silard is an associate professor of leadership and the director of the Center for Sustainable Leadership at Louis Business School in Rome, also the president for the Social Leadership, Washington, US, and an author of 2 personal development books as well. Thank you so much for making time.
Yeah, thanks for having me on your show, Trevor.
So let's talk about leadership. How do you define a good leader?
Well, people often ask me, like, what is it like? What does it take to be an effective leader? And I would say one of the top responses I would say would be find something greater than yourself and dedicate your life to it. So leaders tend to be passionate about something that goes beyond themselves. I'll give an example of Kwame Nkrumah. In Ghana. So his ideas around Pan-Africanism there was this selfless motivation. He was willing to adopt Swahili as a Pan-Africanist language, even though it was thousands of miles away in East Africa, because he knew. And if people had listened, we'd have an African Union in addition to a European Union. Yeah. So I think leaders tend to see beyond what's right in front of them. Also, leaders tend to be very, very empathetic, compassionate, to be able to meet people where they are rather than where the leaders themselves are. And then leaders are able to build trust with people. Yeah. I would say the #1 leadership quality, if you look at all of the surveys on leadership, #1 quality is always honesty. Leaders are people with honest and with integrity. So people feel like, what they commit to, they're actually going to deliver on. Otherwise, people won't go anywhere with them.
Yeah. It's the building that trust that is where the rubber really meets the road. Because if you talk about the public and private sector, there's a very stark difference there. Because when it's public, then everybody's looking up to you. And you're supposed to go with the greater good for the people. But who decides what the greater good is? We're in a conversation where people never see eye to eye. Mm-hmm. So which side do you go with as a good leader?
Yeah. It's interesting because I've taught in a public administration department at California State University, and I teach now at Louis Business School. So we have a lot of private sector, clients, students, and companies that we partner with. And I think the difference between the public and private sector is not as great as people think. Because even in the private sector, if people don't feel they can trust you, if they don't feel they can look up to you, even if they don't feel that the company is doing something for society that goes beyond just making money, then people lose motivation. And I think they expect the same as they do from public leaders to really have some kind of social benefit, some kind of interest that goes just beyond money making.
Yeah. But do you plan for this long term? How do you plan the leadership progress in your own view? Is this something you plan, or is this something you fumble upon? There are many people who say leaders are born. Are they made? Are they born?
Yeah. Well, that's a good question, Trevor. So I often ask people these questions in my conferences, and is a leader born or made? Yeah. And for example, you can find the more extroverted kids in the sandbox, right? And you can say, okay, that child is more likely to be a leader, but it's actually not true. In fact, Adam Grant at Wharton Business School did a study about how extroverted leaders, one of the challenges is that sometimes their followers, their team members, don't feel like they can speak up because they feel like they're kind of crowded out by the leader taking all of the airtime. The thing about the trajectory of leaders is that, unfortunately, many leaders are elected or selected because they represent the group. They represent the characteristics, features, values of the group. And then what happens over time is that the leaders, once someone rises through the ranks and rises in status and becomes a leader, all eyes are on them. And then what happens is that they often start saying, hey, I'm really special. Like, I must just be amazing and extraordinary because I was selected to be the leader. And so over time, they actually start to lose their empathy for the exact people who selected them. It's kind of this leadership arc where the leaders begin being very prototypical of the group, representing their values and characteristics, and then they often kind of go over this hurdle where they start becoming more narcissistic, and then you see them fade out. I'll give you an example, like Will Smith. at the Academy Awards. So here's the third highest paid individual in an industry of over 250,000 people in the motion picture industry. So at that point, people often start to just play by their own rules. There's a saying I have, which is that if you live at the top of the pyramid, you're only surrounded by air. And so what happens is you start to think you can do really whatever you want. Yeah. And you lose touch with your actual constituents, with your team. So leaders often have to be aware of that and really try not to lose that empathy. A really interesting social psychological study they did was they put leaders at a table with their team members, and they brought in a plate of cookies. And what they found was that leaders were most likely to eat more cookies than everyone else, to eat with their mouths open more than everyone else, and to let more crumbs fall out of their mouths onto the table than anyone else. So it's like this kind of like losing touch, like losing this kind of empathy
like
and
the rules don't apply anymore.
What's that?
Like the rules don't apply anymore.
Yeah, the rules don't apply anymore. And this is a big mistake because that's sort of the beginning of the end for most leaders. Now, you also see that some leaders don't follow that path. And I think really those who don't tend to have a lot of humility. There tends to be, like if you take Pope Francis, for example, like not wanting to go and live in the regal sort of papal, residence in the Vatican, and wanting to go instead and live humbly, washing the feet of some of his followers. Yeah. We need more humble leaders like that who are really. They're teachable. Yeah. They're what I would say is that most people go through life. Leaders grow through life. So being willing to continue growing and being willing to realize, like, hey, you know what? I'm not perfect. And just like everyone else, I've got my challenges. And instead of pretending to be perfect, I'm being more open and saying, I need to find people who complement me well. Yeah. Rather than being threatened by such people, because together we can really create a better organization or company.
That raises an interesting point for me, because then which leader is more effective? The more assertive one or the more humble one, which sometimes can be misconstrued to be weak? Humility can be misconstrued to be weakness.
Exactly, and empathy can be construed to be weakness. Yeah. So this was the challenge with Obama when he was running in his first term, is that his opponents would say that he was weak, right? Because he was empathetic, and so this is the thing. I would say one thing I would share with your listeners, if you're going to learn one thing about leadership, it's that all dichotomies are false dichotomies. If you're just going to be empathetic and that's all you're going to focus on, you become a doormat for others. If you're just going to be assertive and that's all you focus on, you become aggressive, toxic, narcissistic. Each of us has to find a balance between empathy and assertiveness. And it's this balance that creates a personal leadership style that makes people very effective. Yeah. And I would say I see very few leaders that really are able to integrate empathy and assertiveness rather than taking one too far.
Let's talk about board strengthening, for example, because here's a structure where there's a leader at the top, maybe the chairperson or something like that, and you have a dissenting opinion as a board member. You're supposed to toe the line. So where then do you draw the line between being an effective leader, someone who's just a pushover, and someone who sticks by the rules? Because sometimes if the chair is wrong, for example, should you just come out and say it out right there that the chairman is wrong and this is the position that we should take? Then who are you to do that, whereas there's a leader who's slightly above you?
Yeah. Well, this is interesting. This brings up an issue of the cultural dimension of power distance. Yeah. So Hofstede in Netherlands did all this research and came up with this cultural research. And one of the cultural dimensions is called power distance. And the idea there is that there are very high power distance cultures. And these are very vertical cultures where they're very vertical organizations where you don't question the leader. Whatever the leader wants to do, again, they play by their own rules. Like you wouldn't even think to talk about anything with the leader. Mm-hmm. They do what they want. And then you have low power distance cultures that are more horizontal. And these are in nations and these are in organizations where, the leader, we can talk with the leader, we can give them feedback. And this is the problem, is that when you have a high power distance culture, the leaders often are not getting feedback because they're from the people they need it from who are on the front line. And so they kind of lose touch with reality. Again, you're at the top of the pyramid, you're only surrounded by air. You get that kind of, so you take like high power, most countries in Africa, Latin America, and Asia are high power distance. In Southern Europe, I did my doctorate in Spain, it's very high power distance. Italy is very high power distance. And then you have low power distance cultures, like, for example, the lowest is considered to be the Netherlands.
Yeah.
Right, where there's a saying in the Netherlands, like if you stick your head out above the rest, it'll get cut off. Right, so there's this real egalitarian sense that you don't you don't need to be individual and stand out above others. Really, we're all together as a team. Everyone has their rights that should be honored.
Yeah.
So we're doing this board strengthening program tomorrow, actually, in Kiambu. It's sponsored by Manada Capital, and the real idea there, I'm doing this pro bono because I think there are so many public schools that really need better governance, better leadership. Yeah. And leadership is this very powerful mechanism that when people can learn how to be effective leaders, learn how to be on a board where actually you can question. If you're a board member and you cannot question the chair, then why are you even there, right? And it's kind of like if everyone was like me, why should I even go outside, right? Yeah. I'm not going to get any new views. So a big part of this is, the sort of Japanese Zen master Shunryu Suzuki wrote a book called Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, and the idea was that if a lot of us want to think of ourselves as experts, but once we become an expert, we close ourselves off to learning. Yeah. And at that point, it's like essentially we start to stagnate. Whereas the better option is to be a beginner, to be open to learning. And if we have that more humble approach where we're teachable, then having others who have different views from ourselves, it's not a threat. Yeah. It's a way that we can look at something from many angles. The Wright brothers who invented the airplane, right? They used to do is they would argue about a specific design, and then they would say, okay, halfway through, let's switch. Yeah. You argue the other side, and I'll argue the other side. Yeah. And so it's kind of a way to sort of cognitively expand and better look at whatever programs or services or products the organization or company wants to deliver.
I was looking at a synopsis of this event you're talking about that you're holding, and part of the background is that there's a crisis in leadership that has resulted in the collapse of our public education system. At the end of this session that you're holding, and you can tell us a bit more about that, what is the one lesson you want them to learn, the people you'll be speaking to?
The one lesson I want them to learn?
Yeah.
I would say if I had to choose one, it would be that you can't become a leader by trying to be like someone else. You have to be yourself, but with purpose. So I have a quote that I often share in my conferences, which is, it's about being authentic, which is, what you think should not always be what you say, but what you say should always be what you think. And so again, what you think should not always be what you say, but what you say should always be what you think. So it's interesting because other people read us like a book. Yeah. And a lot of us don't realize that, but the human cognition of the social space around us is just incredible. I mean, even within seconds, you can have, for example, there's been studies where people would look at pictures of two presidential candidates, and they would view the pictures for like 1/16 of a second. And with 70% accuracy, they could say who was going to be the winner. Just by reading in 1/16 of a second, they could tell who's more confident, who's more likely to win. And so we as human beings, it's interesting, like the way we rose to the top of the food chain is because of this social cognition, because of our capacity to read others and be able to fit into a social group. So whether, a long time ago we wanted to run a mammoth off of a cliff, now, we want to build news studios and schools and companies and sports clubs and all of these kinds of different organizations and group initiatives. And actually, if you look at it, the cerebral cortex of a human being, if you look at the percentage of the total brain size, that's the prefrontal cortex, which is where empathy resides, where our sort of cognition of social events around us resides. It's more than 3 times the size in proportion to the total brain size of any other animal. And this is really what we learned how to do. The evolutionary anthropologist Robin Dunbar in the UK, he came up with this theory that the prefrontal cortex as a percentage of the total brain size, the reason it becomes larger in any species is because they have to interact with a larger social group. And so when we think about these schools, and we think about other public agencies and so forth, where boards are coming together, what they're trying to do is form these larger and larger social groups where you have the students, the teachers, the parents, the board members, and somehow trying to organize all of that towards some kind of public good. And it's not easy.
Yeah.
Right? But it's a lot of different personalities. But I think the important thing that we're going to be focusing on tomorrow is going to be around developing a strategic plan, having sort of this consistency between the mission and vision of the school and the core actions. Because then once the board has a focus, then people come together. But when there's no focus, then you have petty politics, bureaucracy, and people lose motivation.
Yeah. How much of this leadership is pegged on the kind of education system that we have?
Well, I mean, I think the education system is like, in many ways, the schools, and the board have to adapt to that. It's kind of like a company adapting to its external circumstances. Yeah. And it's the same. I mean, they have to take that mission that they have and adapt it, integrate it with the school system. Yeah. So yeah, it's interesting because the 844 system in Kenya is very similar to what I grew up with in the U.S. Mm-hmm. I have to say, I'm really impressed with, in terms of leadership and how things are going here in Kenya. It's interesting because I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Wandani back in 1990 to 92. So when I came here, there was a time where the Western world was really pushing multi-party democracy on Kenya. And it happened really fast. You remember like Smith Hempstone, the U.S. ambassador at that time. There was a lot of pressure. There was a lot of ethnic conflict that emerged because of that. Yeah. A lot of good people perished. And it happened really, really quickly. The irony is that at that time, the Western world was saying, hey, we have this model of democracy and Kenya should adapt. And now what we're seeing, I think with this past election in Kenya, is that Kenya is becoming a model for the world of multi-party democracy, because the polarization, ever since we had these things, ever since we had our phones and our tablets and our laptops, we've become very polarized. Yeah. The level of polarization, and there's studies, for example, Nicholas Epley at University of Chicago did a number of studies showing that when we're interacting with people through text or email or Facebook Messenger, electronic communication, that we actually, or social media, we're actually not even seeing other people as human beings. There's this dehumanization that's taking place that results in this polarization. So if you look at, for example, you go back in US history, you go back to like JFK, for example, the opposition, like 40% of the opposition was still voting for him, right? Today, there's like less than 10% of the opposition is voting for an incumbent president of the other party in the United States, for example. Yeah. Here in Kenya, I'm very impressed because I see a lot of people no longer voting strictly on ethnic lines, but really being more open to who they think can best serve the country. And I think after a lot of discord after the election, people have come together. I think it's a good example for other Western countries experiencing really high levels of polarization right now.
It's interesting that you should bring up the digital age, because you're an author of a book called The Art of Living Free in the Digital Age, right?
Yeah, so, Screened In, The Art of Living Free in the Digital Age.
Yeah, exactly. What do you recommend there? Should we stay away from these things?
Well, it's kind of too late. Yeah. I mean, it would be great if we could just throw this under a matatu, right? And, and then that would be it. But we really can't do that. We need this for directions. I've got my Spotify, my music on here. Yeah. My wife maybe needs to call me, or vice versa, or send a quick message for logistics. So I would say what we have to recognize is that why do we go on these things? We go on these things because we seek social connection. We as human beings, again, like we only survive and thrive because of our ability to integrate into social groups. In fact, there's research on what's called the default network. Yeah. So default cognitive network is when you're resting, for example, and you've been working and now you take a rest. What are you thinking about? Mm-hmm. Most of the time, you're thinking social, thinking about relationships. What did my girlfriend say, my boyfriend, my husband, my wife, my parents, my kids, what happened? We're always thinking about relationships. We're wired for that. So we go on these things, we go on these phones and laptops, computers, seeking social connection. But what do we get? We get social information. Now, social information, it would be wonderful if that led to more social connection, but it doesn't. It's the opposite. You want to guess the #1 reported emotion of Facebook users? It's envy. Right? And one of my favorite studies, Karen Hennigan in the 1970s, social psychologist, they did this study in the US of when the television was introduced. 1951, all across America, people could buy TVs. And then what happened was there were 47 municipalities in the United States where they said, you know what, we don't want these TVs. We don't trust them. They're going to bring in outside influences, and you know, we don't think they're healthy for our citizens. And so they banned them. And so what they did was they realized that in these, Hennigan and her colleagues, they did this study where they took these 47 municipalities that weren't able to get the television in 1951, and they actually, there was a federal overturn of these local laws where they said, you know, you can't ban people from having TVs. You have to allow it. By 1955, these 47 municipalities people were able to buy TVs. So they found 47 similar municipalities in terms of demographics. And in those, in 1951, when the TV was introduced, what did they find? A big increase in crime. Petty theft, people stealing bicycles, pickpocketing, and so forth. And then, but it didn't happen in the 47 municipalities where the TV wasn't allowed to be introduced. But 4 years later, when those 47 municipalities were allowed to have television, they saw the same thing, increase in misdemeanors, petty theft, and so forth. So what happens is people go on these screens and they see others and they go, well, their lives are better than mine. Yeah. And they've got more material things than I do, so I'm going to go steal from them. And what we do now, we go on Facebook and Instagram and so forth, and we see, like, men try to make themselves look bigger. Women try to often use shrinking software to make themselves look thinner, at least in the U.S. and Western Europe. And in general, like people upload like the one photo from a week-long family vacation where everyone's smiling, and then you go on there and you go, wow. My friend from high school, who I never talked to anymore, who I seem to be wanting to see pictures of his family vacation, how come her family is smiling and my family doesn't? What's wrong with me? So this is part of the reason we're seeing huge increase in loneliness, depression, anxiety, mental health issues. In the United States, ever since the introduction of the smartphone, the teen suicide rate for the first time in US history has exceeded the teen homicide rate. So teens are killing themselves more, killing each other less. It's actually 32% higher. We're seeing for young women, self-cutting has gone up from 2009, 2 years after the iPhone was introduced, and the Android phones came in 2008. 2009 to 2015, every single year, there's an 18% increase in emergency room visits for self-cutting, only among teenage girls. Young teenage women. You don't see it in boys, right? And it's often because people are feeling like they want to feel something, so they're cutting themselves. Yeah. So there's all these kinds of very negative indicators. Kristen Byron at Virginia State did this research and she found what's called a negative affective bias of electronic communication, which means that if you send an electronic message like a text or an email and you intend for it to be positive, it's almost always received by the recipient as being emotionally neutral. When you send a text or email intending it to be emotionally neutral, it's usually received by the recipient as being emotionally negative. So there's this kind of downwards emotional slide in our relationships. The more we use these instead of talking in person, or as Leslie Seltzer, University of Wisconsin, her researchers found, a telephone call is really parallels in person. Like, so if you can't meet with someone in person, at least calling them on the phone rather than texting. But that's not happening. I taught in an MBA program in Barcelona. One of my students, who became a good friend from Scotland, he told me in the 2 years of his MBA, he never once called another student. Everything was texting by WhatsApp. Yeah. And so the less we connect with each other, and the more we rely on these instruments to create connection, which they really don't. Yeah. I mean, these can be good. For example, you can go onto like a dating site, and some couples do very well. They meet on a dating site, but then they develop their relationship offline, and it goes very well. Yeah. These can be good for like people with similar interests grouping together. But once that happens, you got to go offline, go in person, face-to-face. And this is very important for leaders because leaders want to inspire their people. And how do you inspire comes from like inward direction. Inspire is breathing, breath, like respiration. So when you inspire, when you feel inspired, it's like you breathe in, like you lose a breath. Well, you try doing that by texting someone or emailing. It doesn't work.
It won't work.
It doesn't work.
It's an interesting perspective that you bring, because I also read somewhere that people are saying that these phones that were meant to bring the people who are farther away to you closer end up taking the people who are closer to you farther away, because even if you're sitting with someone else, you're on your phone. But would you associate that with lack of leadership? These things that we keep throwing at people without proper guidance or even leadership, that these are the parameters of using it. But then how does that relate to freedom? Because then you can't give a phone and give limits. You can only do that as a parent to a teenager at some point. But also that they find a way of circumventing it. So is there a lack of leadership?
That's an excellent point you've made, Trevor. And I like the way you put that. You said that you can connect with people that are further away, but they push the people that are closer further away. So you said it better than I did. So there's actually, this has been proven. It's called a displacement effect. The more time we're on our phones, our screens, our tablets, our laptops, the less time we spend with the people we love, our family and friends, and the more depressed we become. So for example, Paula Clem did this research on women with breast cancer, and when they had face-to-face support groups that they met with each week, there was a decrease in 92% in feeling depressed because they had breast cancer. When they did these same support groups but online, guess what the percentage decrease was in feeling depressed? 0. Right? So the issue of freedom is so critical right now that you raise, and leadership, because what's happening now is that essentially in the pandemic, leaders didn't have a whole lot of choice. People had to social distance, and what happened was, inadvertently, leaders gave people a lot of freedom and a lot of power over the way they manage their lives. And they said, okay, you can go work from home. In fact, you know what? You're paying too much rent in Nairobi. Go move out to a rural area, and you can work remotely, and you're going to pay half the rent, or you can even buy a house. And so now, a lot of people don't want to come back to the office. And this is the thing about power. When you give people power, it's very hard to walk it back. And so leaders do have to step up to this challenge, because if people don't come together, there's really this sense of, what do we need leaders for? Because this is what's happening now is like the kind of Airbnb-ization of the workplace, where people now are like, no, I'm going to stay home. I'm going to be on my laptop, and I'm going to Zoom in or Teams in to work. And I have a lot of people that I clients and people I've worked with that say, no, they want me to go back to the office, but they're not giving me a parking spot, so I'm not going. People are so caught up in their cognitive preferences that it's really challenging now for leaders to bring people together. And so many leaders I'm working with, they're saying, I don't know what to do. How do you build a sense of teamwork, sense of comradeship when everybody's working online? And it's really, really challenging. In fact, the research I'm working on a new book. We're doing a lot of research on the effects of Zoom and Teams and and WebEx and video conferencing. And people feel more emotionally exhausted. They feel more stressed. They feel burned out, especially people who are in the minority in an organization. So minority group members, whether it's by ethnicity, whether it's by gender, whether it's by sexual orientation, whether it's by age, they feel like they're the ones being watched. And so they're watching themselves. They got their own screen, their own image there looking back at them, and they're really stressed about it, about how they're being perceived. Whereas people who've been in the organizations a long time and are of the majority group, they're like, oh, this is fine. We can be on Zoom. Like they're not worried. There's not as much evaluation apprehension, like fear of how they're being evaluated. And so this is creating lots of disparities and a lot of people just burning out.
And it's interesting that you bring that up, because you see, even during this COVID-19 period, there was a lot of things that changed in terms of the structure of leadership in a family. All of a sudden, parents realized we can't handle these kids because we used to spend most of the time at work. Now we are with them. And it's almost like a board setup that you're talking about, because especially if the father and mother is also there. Is this related in any way to the resources? Because this is a social structure where the person who has the most is automatically the leader. Is that supposed to be the situation or
That's
not?
exactly what's happening, Trevor. Yeah. And I'm also doing a lot of research on gender and leadership right now. And so COVID has been particularly challenging for women. You see pictures of women, and I have many personal examples of this, where the man is working at the dining room table on his laptop, and he's remote working in, and then the woman is working in the closet, or even a bathroom. Right, and then also women are noting that wow, like I thought, because the husband is home, he's going to take on a larger share of the housework and childcare, but he's not doing it, right? And so there's a really interesting study in the U.S. because the U.S. and not just U.S. but Sweden and Scandinavia, Western Europe, Britain. People like to see themselves as very gender enlightened. Yeah. But this statistic sheds some real light on whether that's true. So if you take, in the United States, if you take a woman who's working full time and her husband who's unemployed, that husband is providing 6 hours more per week of housework and childcare. He's doing 6 hours more each week of taking care of the kids and cleaning up the house because he's not working. Now switch roles. You have a fully employed man and an unemployed wife. Okay, that woman is doing 46 hours more per week of housework and childcare, more than 750% more. So we're seeing like this idea of like gender equality and so forth. It's a myth. It's not happening, and we still have all of these disparities, and so this has to be addressed. And I think, especially now in this kind of age of mass distraction, unfortunately, what's really happening is that we had like women flocking to the workplace over the last 50, 60 years, but we didn't see anyone flocking to the home. Men, as this survey I shared with you, as that documents, like men are not sort of filling that gap of women also going to the workplace. So what happens? Children are growing up with the electronic babysitter, their phones, their tablets, their computers. And as a result, they're losing their self-regulatory abilities. So they're not able to regulate emotions very well. They're not able to interact well. It's interesting because throughout society, we've always said, the adults have always said, especially older people, these young people, they go out all the time, they're having sex more, they're doing all drugs, they're doing all these things, right? It's not like that anymore. Young people are actually, they're going out less, they're less social, they're having sex less. All of the things that we think of as like sort of these sort of parts of growing up are happening much less, especially that are social. And as a result, we also have always traditionally thought of that the loneliest people in our society are the oldest people, right? So we always think, imagine, for example, you're 80 years old, right? Your kids stop by less. People see you as less competent, as frail, as unproductive, and your friends are dying. It sounds like a pretty lonely formula, right? Well, guess what? In today's society, the loneliest people now are the youngest people. And it's the first time in our history that this has happened. The youngest people are the loneliest. If you look at the Cigna surveys of loneliness, they use the UCLA loneliness scale, youngest people are the loneliest. And because, for you and I, Trevor, like we were born without these, right? We're not digital natives. But imagine you're born and this is your, you need a mother and father to help you understand social relationships. And they're not there. You're learning it from this. You go on here trying to find social connection. Again, you just get social information. It makes, for example, you get invited by some popular kids at school. Hey, come and join us on this group chat. You go on there. They spend 2 minutes telling you how ugly and fat and stupid you are. And then they kick you off the group chat. This is stuff that's happening today. And young brains, they're not ready to handle that kind of ostracism. It's lethal. That's why we see the suicide rate increasing among our teens, as well as like anxiety, depression, and so forth. So yeah, we think about leadership. We really can't talk about leadership without rising to the challenge of leadership in the age of mass distraction. And especially the rawest form of leadership is parenting. And many parents today are neglecting their responsibility to help their children navigate social relationships, which is the #1 responsibility of parents. Have you ever heard of the concept of the 4th trimester? The idea is that the human brain actually could not fit through the birth canal once we became bipeds and walking on 2 feet. And so for that reason, most of our brain development occurs outside the womb. And in fact, it goes on till our 20s and even 30s. And really, the development is primarily social. It's about how to navigate the social world. And we rely on our caretakers. Jenny Radesky, who wrote the screen use guidelines for the American Academy of Pediatrics, I interviewed her in my book, Screened In, The Art of Living Free in the Digital Age. Jenny calls it a conversational duet. Yeah. And you see this. You see some parents that are continually having these conversations with their kids. The kids are saying things, and they're dueling. They're going back and forth. What's happening is the children that grow up that way, their vocabulary is more than double those than parents who have like 2 or 3 jobs. They're not home much. They've got their or they're just busy, and they've got their kids with the electronic babysitter. And those kids are not. Their vocabularies are like half of what of the children who have more attentive parents, and they're not really learning how to navigate social relationships, which is what, if you look at what causes anxiety, what causes depression, the #1 reason is not feeling that we have the social connections around us that we need. Even trauma, social relationships, #1 way to work through trauma is when it's shared with other people. This is a fantastic conversation. I'd like to continue on and on, but we're running out of time here because one of the things you also mentioned there is a conversation between parents and their children. Where I grew up, it was not a democracy. It was the iron fist rule. What parents say, that's it. So you don't speak back to them. But finally, as you're parting short, as we end on this conversation, what should people look for in a leader as we end on this conversation? You can also take the time to invite the people for the event you have. Okay, sure. Oh, thanks, Trevor. So what do we look for in a leader? I would say we look for someone we can trust, someone like us, someone who doesn't think that they are greater than we are, but someone who comes from our ranks and can represent us, someone who cares, someone who is full of compassion and empathy. And you see, leaders, just by the nature of their position, they have higher status than the rest of us. Yeah. And so you can even look at it very simply. Some individuals in leadership roles accentuate their status and push us down, and others attenuate their status and push us up. That's what we're looking for. We know they're higher than we are, but we don't want that gap to be too high. Well, I would say if you are on a board and you're interested in joining us tomorrow in Kiambu for our board strengthening program, I'm doing this pro bono. I love Kenya, and I'm just happy to be here, and I love interacting with people here. Kenya is a big part of my own identity, believe it or not. I mean, I came here when I was in the Peace Corps when I was 23, and it really changed my life. Honestly, I didn't feel very worthy. I was very low self-esteem as a kid, and coming to Kenya, people made me feel like I had value, like people cared. People took time to talk with me, to ask me about myself. And I felt like I was given a role in the community in Taita, where we did this working. I actually ended up starting a nonprofit organization, and we had a division in Wandani, as well as Tanzania, Guatemala, Indonesia, and the U.S. Yeah. And so I would say, if you're interested in joining us, Karibu Sana. We'll be there tomorrow, starting at 8:30 a.m. And if you're either on a board or interested in being on a school board or another public agency or even private sector board, and you'd like to come and learn about better governance and leadership, then happy to have you join us. All right. Thank you. Thank you for making time this morning, Dr. Antony Silard, an Associate Professor of Leadership and the Director of the Center for Sustainable Leadership at Luis Business School in Rome, and also a distinguished visiting professor and author of 2 personal development books as well. Quite accomplished. All right. That's where we leave it for now. I hope you've learned all you need to learn about leadership. And my name is Trevor Mbija. It's always a pleasure having you with us. Let's do this again tomorrow. Bye for now.